Where rainbows touch down, the experience of openly gay and lesbian United Church ministers in Canada. We're in Shirley's hands for the next hour. Shirley, you're on.
Thank you. The Orlando nightclub massacre on June 12, 2016, left 49 people dead, 53 wounded, mostly Hispanic, mostly male, mostly gay. I had a sincere feeling of devastation when that happened, but wasn't quite sure what I, as a straight person, might be able to do about it. When in a Ministry Matters email came out, and a Baptist minister said that as a result of the Orlando nightclub massacre, she had decided to come out. And she did so on the floor of General Synod. As a consequence of that action, she was defrocked by her church. And this was the impetus for me doing this particular grad project. I wanted to look at the lived experiences of openly gay and lesbian ministers in the United Church because I thought it was time we did a check-in. It's been a while since the decision was made to ordain openly gay and lesbian ministers in the United Church of Canada. So I wanted to see just exactly how we're doing with that. The title of the project is When Rainbows Touch Down, the lived experiences of openly gay and lesbian ministers in the United Church of Canada. In 1988, the United Church of Canada determined that sexual orientation would not be a barrier to ordination. The following is a qualitative research study of what has happened since that time. The good and the bad. All participants stated that they have had more good than bad experiences as openly gay and lesbian ministers in the United Church. However, as we talked, it became clear that the bad experiences had serious and far-reaching consequences. As one participant stated, the bad stuff sticks because it hurts. These are your friends, your faith family, who are supposed to love and protect you. As a result, we are going to spend some time looking at those bad experiences first. Matthew 25, verse 45. He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Hostile environments. All participants in the study experienced some aspects of working in hostile environments. These environments were characterized by pain, anger, vulnerability, and marginalization. Pain. Have you ever experienced discrimination? whether it be based on race, age, gender, sexual orientation, or any other category. If you haven't, then you may not know what that feels like. I had a young person once describe the pain to me of her being discriminated against as feeling like someone had put their hands inside of you and torn you in two. That's the kind of pain gay and lesbian ministers have been subjected to over the years in their work and their day-to-day lives. One participant said congregants would make blanket statements about gay people being pedophiles and things like that. I would listen to people run down people who were gay. It was very difficult to have to listen to those people and try to be pastoral. Anger. One participant said, I find it draining that those who are not affirming are coddled. It's like we need to uphold their bigotry. I find that challenging. I can be pretty diverse theologically, but this is something I can't understand. It's difficult when people won't name it, homophobia. The same participant and others expressed that it's 2017 already. Almost 30 years have passed since the 1988 decision, and they believe it's time people got on board or left the ship. They are tired of having to face bigotry on every single level of the church and act like it's okay. The same person who told me what it felt like to be discriminated against also told me she repeatedly was told, "You're a smart woman. You should get over it. Suck it up and keep going." Isn't it time we move past the point of putting it back on the victims of discrimination to suck it up? Isn't it time for people in churches to take a stand and refuse to make those behaviors acceptable? Marginalization. One participant talked about how until the same-sex marriage became law, that there was really no significant change in how LGBTQ people were treated in the church, even though the 1988 decision happened well before the same-sex marriage law came into effect in July of 2005. She said that created a societal shift, and the United Church shifted with it. She said she finally felt safe in coming out. All participants experienced varying degrees of marginalization in the church and in community, but all of them felt it's improving. The changes of how society now views homosexuality has directly impacted the participants and the church itself. The structure of the United Church's governance model is quite unique in that we govern from the bottom up, as opposed to most other churches that have a governing head, like the Pope, who stipulates change for the entire church. The United Church can make policy on the General Council level, but cannot compel individual congregations to adopt that policy. United Church historian Reverend Dr. Ross Bartlett says, the General Council adopted a couple of policies. In the case of clergy, it declared that orientation in and of itself was not a barrier to ordination or commissioning. And you would be hard-pressed to find a congregation that rejected a minister openly and officially because of their orientation. That would be in violation of church and civil law standards. However, there are numerous ways to quietly and unofficially make that choice. I've seen it happen. Presbytery would not be able to prove that and contest it. We can believe things like the reason someone was not called to a church and not be able to prove them. There is no way to compel a congregation to accept a minister they do not want. It's a covenantal agreement between willing partners. As human rights tribunals have found, believing we see discrimination and proving it are quite different things. Furthermore, what would be the practical outcome of forcing a minister on a pastoral charge, both for the charge and the ministry personnel? As for the marriage question, the right of congregations to determine what worship services will occur is pretty fundamental in our understanding of church. The General Council can pass policies. It can strongly recommend those policies. It can force congregations to make sure that other provisions are made, but it cannot compel. We might think that in certain cases, power to compel might be a good thing. But I can think of situations in our history where it would have been very bad indeed. Because we agree with the General Council in one area should not blind us to the fact that such authority, if granted, would be across the board. What would be accomplished through compulsion? The congregation could simply decide not to do weddings at all. No one can force a minister to preside over a wedding. These are hard questions for a church that has tended to opt for persuasion and education rather than compulsion. Other denominations. This does leave our church, excuse me, in an interesting and unique position in this regard. In this case, our church is able to adopt these policies without worrying that congregations who theologically disagree with them do not have to adopt it themselves. Where a church such as the Anglican Church would have to compel all churches in its union to agree with the policy set at the highest level. This is not the case for the United Church. Other denominations have been working on ways these issues can be dealt with in their churches, but are doing so carefully as they recognize they are dealing with not just varying degrees of theology in this regard, but also with very different societal contexts in areas where they have churches throughout the world, in countries in Africa and South America, for instance, where societal norms and values are considerably different than they are here in Canada. Other denominations do have LGBTQ clergy in their midst. Some are out, some closeted. The Anglicans have commissioned at least 2 openly gay bishops in Canada and the United States. The Lutherans often employ a don't ask, don't tell strategy. Stephen L. Alstead et al. Says, in some cases in the US, the Lutheran Church has defrocked an openly gay minister only to have the congregation continue to employ that minister, often with the threat of sanctions from the church. But to my knowledge, those threats have never been carried out. Seeing that there continues to be lack of conformity in all United Churches in Canada only strengthens the holdbacks on unilateral policies for other progressive Christian denominations. The theologies, 4 main theologies employed for this study are liberation, inclusion, Christological, and hospitality. Liberation theology and theologies of inclusion both focus on freedom from oppression. Christology focuses on the love of God and the Great Commandment, loving God and loving our neighbors. In Hospitality Matters, a theology of hospitality, Scott Corbin says, "As God has been hospitable to us through the giving of his Son, so we display God's hospitable love towards others in the giving of ourselves, opening our homes and hearts towards others. When we display the kind of radical love and hospitality to others, we are living out God's will in this world. We are bringing ourselves one step closer to realizing the kingdom of heaven here on earth." The numbers. I have to say I was quite shocked when I received these. The United Church currently has 2,888 congregations. Of that, they have 165 affirming bodies, which includes congregations, educational institutions, presbyteries, and conferences. But in total, there are only 141 congregations that are actually affirming. It's easy to see why many are still feeling marginalized and vulnerable based on these numbers. Some churches are affirming in practice without having undergone the formal process of becoming affirming, which doesn't just impact the LGBT community, but any marginalized group. One participant said when she went to her current church, they knew she was lesbian, and it was not an issue. They were performing same-gender marriages and baptisms of children to gay couples. But she told her congregation that until they actually went through the formal affirming process, that they were not truly standing with her. The church celebrated the conclusion of becoming affirming with a special service where individuals from any number of backgrounds were invited to pour sand into a common jar, where it was then mixed together, symbolizing they were all one. Vulnerability. One participant said, "I know of a case where an openly gay minister was settled in an extremely conservative area, and the people there practically drove her out of town. LGBT people were being put into unsafe situations, and that was a huge failure on the part of the church." All participants talked about being in situations and circumstances where they did not feel safe. Safety actually came up in a lot of our conversations. In this particular case, the participant was referring to an older model of settlement for new ministers in the church. In that process, the church was supposed to match new ministers with congregations, which clearly was not the case for this particular minister. The church no longer uses this method to settle ministers. Under the new call system, prospective ministers apply for vacancies they feel called to serve. This makes the process significantly safer for openly gay and lesbian ministers. But safety concerns were also raised about being outed at meetings, about vulnerability in employment opportunities, dealing with hostile congregants, and with no protections for LGBTQ ministers who were subjected to abuses. Participants complained vehemently there is no backup to protect them when these things occur. One participant said, when the United Church is talking about apologies to the LGBT community for mistreatment over the years, but can't even name something that's right in front of them with one of their own, It makes that apology seem hollow. They want homophobia to be named for what it is, and they want it not to be tolerated in the name of a good and loving Christian God. Matthew 22, verses 36 to 40. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. I'm going to have to skip past this slide. For some reason, my numbers are my notes.
Something was going on with your remote.
Oh, it went back instead of forward. Okay, that would be why. It went back quite a bit. There we go. Thank you. Hospitable environments, the good. The themes that came out under this category are liberation, solidarity, relief, and completion. One participant said, being able to be out in ministry has also been a fulfilling and life-giving experience. It has made me more open and honest and transparent in my ministry. It's made my ministry more personable. I don't have to worry about someone going to out me. I can just be who I am, and people have been very accepting of that. You also become more accepting of yourself when you can be open and honest about who you are too. 75% of the participants came from other denominations and did so because the United Church offered them the opportunity to live out their lives freely and be true to themselves. All participants expressed that they enjoy being a role model for others who are and may continue to be marginalized. They recount stories of parents coming to them and thanking them for being there and asking them to speak with their youth children who are struggling with their own identity. Just living in a community with their partners affords them a sense of freedom and comfort they would not have if they remained closeted. Relief. One participant said, I'm excited about working with people on a larger scale, about becoming affirming and what that means. Having people know they can express sexuality with me, especially from outside of the church. Being a safe person where others can freely discuss sexuality and discover faith within that context. Participants experience a sense of relief in not having to live a lie. They say living out their sexuality in relationships opens themselves and others to conversations that allow both a better understanding of sexuality and faith. Participants especially express the importance of being able to talk freely with young persons who were struggling with their sexual or gender identity. That open dialogue came up in each interview. Participants want to represent their church, their faith, and who they are in ways that are both meaningful and helpful to others. One participant said, "The openness of the church and its philosophy have put me in positions where I can be a role model. And because I can present openly as a gay minister, people will engage in conversations with me that otherwise might not occur if barriers were there, not only within the church itself, but also in ecumenical forms. In terms of dialogue, my sexual orientation has profoundly affected my ministry. I have served 2 pastoral charges. At times, people are just seeking knowledge. Other times, there is animosity. But when we can talk, and I can come to it from a theological standpoint, rather than just because I'm gay, it makes a difference." There. Solidarity. People expressed unity with other marginalized groups. There was a strong sense of that. One of the minister's first call was to an ecumenical church who worked with a disabled population. He said it was actually a bonus that he was gay. They actually wanted somebody who had experienced marginalization themselves because they thought they would be able to understand the needs of their congregants. Another of the ministers went to work in a First Nations community. That church was not affirming, but they knew that she was openly gay when they hired her. She said the possibility of that church actually becoming affirming is very low because they are a First Nations community and their societal issues surrounding teen suicide, alcoholism, substance abuse, poverty, truth and reconciliation are the main issues there, and she's there to serve her congregants and their needs, not her own. So they feel a solidarity with others who are like themselves. Again, over and over again, dialogue came up, especially dialogue with young people. Understanding and what the others in our society may be experiencing. So they felt that as a unity, a gift. Completion. One participant said, "What I find most life-giving is being able to live out my sexuality, my relationship, my union in an environment where I feel welcomed and not pushed away or into a closet. I can preach on sexual orientation. I can engage in theological discussion and education, and I can talk with anyone without feeling hypocritical about being me. Far more so than in my former tradition, I am able to bring my whole self into my ministry." A feeling of completion in being able to bring their whole selves into their ministry was also a repeated theme for participants. Being able to be out in their ministry allows them to live their whole lives without hypocrisy or lies. In that there is a sense of freedom, relief, and an increased confidence in their own personal well-being. Genesis 1, verse 27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Conclusion. One participant said, in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity, I think the institution has taken on a prophetic role and one of leadership. But that does not mean there isn't still work to be done. The primary recommendation from participants in regards to how to move forward is to back up policy with action and continue to work towards full inclusion. One participant said, I think the area where the church has failed is in taking action when those policies are not followed. If you're going to make policy, you have to be prepared to back it up. Galatians 3, verse 28. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. I have a list of works cited. And now it's time for questions.
Questions, comments, thoughts?
Thank you, Shirley. I wonder if you could just elaborate a little on this formal process of affirmation, of being an affirming congregation, and perhaps comment on the pros and cons. And I'll tell you why I'm asking. I can think of many congregations that have older people who are not bad people, but they've been brought up at a different time, are very conservative. And if they were asked, we've got to have a vote, are we going to be affirming or not, it would be contentious, and there's a need for leadership and time. And just by way of background, my mother, retired United Church minister, a graduate of Pine Hill, retired to a congregation in Victoria when the issue of gay marriage came up. Mm-hmm. And the congregation was going to discuss it, and there was great concern about dissension within the congregation. And Mum actually just went and sat down with some of the gay members of the congregation and said, what do you think? And as a result, she was very much a leader. And today, that church has a big rainbow on its website, and it's generally known as the Gay Church of Victoria. But I was just a little concerned when, okay, there's only 140 congregations that are formally affirming. But I suspect there's quite a few congregations that are, but just aren't registering that way. So could you just talk about the formal part of that, please?
Yeah. There are churches who are in fact affirming in practice, but haven't gone through the official process. And there can be a number of reasons for why they haven't gone through that official process. Things like time and resources to get through doing that when they're struggling to keep their doors open. I've heard people say that John and Joe, who come to your church and sit in your pews every week, and everybody knows them and loves them, and they've become accepted, they have no problem marrying John and Joe in that church, but the church hasn't officially become affirming. People are comfortable with the people they're comfortable with. So yeah, I do think that there is, a number of churches now that are in fact affirming in practice, but not officially. The concern that the participant raised about that was she felt that her congregation was not truly standing with her unless they did in fact become affirming. And that congregation chose to do so. I do think the numbers are changing. I think times are changing and it's getting better. But I actually had, one of my participants, the woman who worked at the First Nations congregation, said she doesn't think it's necessary anymore. She thinks that, that you need to do what's best for the congregation that you're in, and if they're able to do that, that's great. And if they're not, but are still willing to, do same-sex marriages, to hire openly gay ministers, that she doesn't have a problem with that. That's fine, and it truly is about meeting the needs of the congregation. Does that help?
Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you, Shirley. You discussed vulnerability. You also mentioned people who were out and people who were in closets, if you will. And as part of the journey, I'm curious about some people that are fighting for affirming, and yet others that may have come out, if you will, and if they expressed any vulnerability, maybe they wish they hadn't, or how that feels for them, and does it affect the ministry?
Yeah, no, actually it was the absolute opposite effect. I had one minister, she's actually been in ministry for 30 years, and spent most of her ministry closeted. And, she's the lady who talked about I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank for some reason. She's the one that talked about people, talking about gay people being pedophiles, that they were all after their children, really bad theology, really serious misrepresentation. And she's decided after going through that experience and that bigotry that she needed to come out when she went to her next church. This was past 2005, and like she said, there seemed to be a real societal shift that came with the government approving same-gender marriage. And she said that she felt that change in the church as well. But every single one of them, 75% of the participants came from closeted environments. There was only one who was actually openly gay when she first started in ministry. So, and two of those just had been in ministry in more conservative churches and left those churches to join the United Church because they could be true to themselves. And they have had very positive experiences as a result of that.
Thanks, Shirley, so much. I was really curious about the fact that you raised many of your participants came to United Church from other denominations, purely because they were able to work in active ministry in a church that accepted them in that way. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to maybe how that shaped the data, and it came as a bit of a surprise to me, and I wonder if it came as a bit of a surprise to you that there were so many people who felt so called to ministry that instead of just kind of denying their call in their own tradition, they struggled through that change and decided to find another tradition that would let them live out that call. And did anyone kind of talk about those struggles? Or did you have any sense yourself of any of that?
Well, I think the main tipping point for them was that they truly felt felt they were being hypocritical, that they were living a lie, that they weren't able to share their spouses, partners, family with the faith community that they were in. And were relieved and liberated to find a church that would, in fact, allow that. One in particular said that, he still has some, more conservative leanings in other areas, but has just found it such a relief to be with a church that allows him to be who he is. That's the same person that said that, he found this to be profound and prophetic leadership in church, to have openly gay and lesbian ministers.
So just as a quick follow-up, so no one really expressed any sense of not feeling called to ministry. They just felt they needed to do it in a more accepting environment?
Oh, these people, well, two of them were actually ministers within their former denomination. And when they left their former denomination and were, seeking a church and discovered the United Church, for them, they sensed that liberation and freedom. They said they still had their call to ministry. That hadn't changed. What had changed was how they wanted to live their lives. You're welcome.
Shirley, thank you for your presentation on what I think is a really important topic, so thank you. When you talk about the difficulties that gay and lesbian ministers have being accepted into congregations, do you think there's an underlying problem there where congregations are really uncomfortable talking about issues of sexuality, period, and whether the church could do something to sort of tackle that underlying problem? Because this is one of the issues we've had in Bermuda. In Bermuda, same-sex marriage is still actually illegal. But one of the things that you run into is churches are really uncomfortable talking about issues of sexuality anyway. And because this is sort of associated with that, that creates a lot of problems, even having those discussions. And I sometimes wonder whether you could sort of almost get underneath that and really tackle the issue of why we are uncomfortable talking about sexuality in the church. Thank you. Just, if you could comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. The bad theology has been around for a really long time. And it's really only in recent years that we're looking at things like liberation theology and theologies of inclusion that have kind of changed the way we think in terms of things like homosexuality. My participants didn't really discuss this, although they said that, because of coming out, they felt comfortable discussing sexuality in church. I have to say, as a straight person, I've preached on sexuality in church, during Pride Week and things like that, so it's something I'm comfortable with, but, clearly it's something the minister is going to have to be comfortable with. And, I think I'm going to quote Jody Clark on this forever, because we had a conversation and Jody talked about the evolution of theology, and that some people have evolved in their theology to the point that they are comfortable with having those kind of conversations and speaking from the pulpit about this. But other people have not, and if they have not, they're likely to do more harm than good. So they better, it's probably best that they avoid it. The affirming process with the United Church does help open minds and open conversations. when I was doing my literature review, I heard of a church that did, after the 1988 decision, people were quite outraged. And they said, what do we do about this? So what they did was the minister contacted people in the local LGBTQ community. And they put it up on their sign outside the church and said, Sunday evening, we're going to have a potluck dinner. We are inviting all people from the LGBTQ community to participate in that. And what we're looking for is open and respectful conversation. And they did that. And it went over so well that it ended up becoming, a monthly thing that they did. And they actually grew their church as a result, because all of a sudden now LGBTQ community members felt comfortable in this church because they knew they were going to be respected. And I thought that was actually quite amazing, a unique approach, and one that really tended to work. And yet one of my participants said that, when she went to her first congregation as an oat minister, that the one couple left. The couple claimed it was because of the sound system, which had actually been in the church for 4 years. So, you would think if they had had a problem with the sound system, they would have left before she got there. But she said once it went up on their website that, she was the minister and this was her wife, all of a sudden, people from the LGBTQ community started coming to that church. So once again, they gained a lot more than they lost. But it's where people are and what they're ready for, I think, David.
Thank you.
2 questions. Yeah, so I have 3 questions.
Thanks, Shirley. I just wanted to ask about the theme you identified of Christology as a theological theme. Can you say more about how you're applying that to this conversation or to your research or analysis?
We're asked to love God with all our heart, soul, and mind, and to love our neighbor. And it doesn't ask us to love our neighbor with exceptions. It asks us to love all of our neighbors. So, I believe truly that that is open to the LGBT community as well as it is to anyone else. When I look at Galatians, and we are all one in Christ Jesus. So that's how I'm applying Christology to this. Is there anything you'd like to add to that? Because I know it's kind of your thing.
Oh. I wouldn't stop talking if I started.
Okay. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. It comes at a very personal level for me. I preached my way out 1.5 years ago in the United Church. So I want to offer thanks to the United Church and those who have gone before me and have really struggled. I preached my way out in a rural United Church in Prince Edward Island to farmers and fishermen and really down-to-earth folk. During the sermon, I said, I won't be staying afterwards because I want to give you a chance. I don't want to blindside you, and I want to give you a chance to reflect. When I left, the congregation rose and clapped. And we think sometimes that older people can't adjust to this. Actually, older people are the best people to adjust. They've seen enough in their life that is just one more thing and the journey rolls on. So I just want to offer thanks to you and thanks to the United Church of Canada and thanks to those who've gone before me. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you. We have all morning. Thanks, Jody.
We've about 6 or 7 minutes left. So.
I kind of jumped the queue, that's all. That's okay. Thanks, Shirley. Because of my position in early part of SFE, I'm sensitive to leadership issues where the value of the congregation and the value of the pastor and the value of the national church might conflict. And I can anticipate being in some circumstances where I feel a real tension on the balance between leadership toward a goal or bullying, imposing my value set on the congregation. Do any of your participants express a difficulty with that? As in,
Can you elaborate just a little bit more on what you're saying? Because I'm not really sure what
sure.
you're asking.
If I'm hired by a community of vegetarians and I like to eat meat, is it appropriate for me to try and persuade the congregation toward, whatever is considered the more progressive stance on that issue, or the stance of the national church compared to where the congregation is? Looking for the balance between serving the congregation as they are, leading them out of the place where they are. So what I'm asking is, in any of the people that you talk to, do they have a concern about that difficulty?
Certainly not once they came out. It was huge for them when they were still closeted, because they didn't feel it was okay for them to discuss sexuality from the pulpit or anywhere else at that point. Some of them worked in churches that had community of concern folks at it, who were extremely bigoted towards all gay people, without knowing their minister was a gay person. And, like one of the participants said, it's really challenging to be pastoral when somebody is spewing forward that kind of hate. So, yeah, I think when they were closeted, yes, but since they've been able to come out, no, they feel that they have the freedom to discuss that quite freely. But, they've also all been hired into positions that were willing to accept an openly gay or lesbian minister. So people kind of knew when they were coming what they were getting, right? So it's not a huge dichotomy between what the congregants want and who the minister is. Does that make sense? Okay.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to ask a couple, about how you found your participants, how many participants you had, because you've talked about percentages of the participants, but I'm not clear how many people you actually talked to, and the process of finding that group of people, and how you decided who you were going to talk to.
There were 4 participants. The only criteria was that they be openly gay and or lesbian in the United Church of Canada. And I have to say it was a struggle to get participants. I thought it would be much easier than it was. I'd have people say yes and then pull back. And I think a lot of that concern was kind of 2 sides of one coin, which was interesting, because there were people who were concerned that because there's not that many gay and lesbian ministers in the United Church of Canada, that regardless of what we did to strip their identities, people would be able to figure out who said what. And, they would basically be known and that confidentiality wouldn't work. Then there was the other side who were like, okay, we're out. Why are you trying to put us back in the closet? So, yeah, 2 kind of flip sides of the coin. Actually, I ended up doing some recruitment through a number of friends, one of whom is a student here at AST and is openly gay. And he was phenomenal and found 3 of my 4 participants for me.
Shirley, thank you very, very much. One of the things that I found in listening to your presentation was your doing the comparative with the marginalization of First Nations and the gay and lesbian community. What you've left me with is a challenge, because as we know in your biblical quotes, particularly Jesus sought out the marginalized and brought them into his community. So I think you've left us, or left me, with a whole new view about marginalization, and I appreciate that, and just wanted to thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We're related. I paid him to say that.
One more quick question, Shirley, and that actually relates to Scripture. And I'm wondering if any of your participants talked about the difficulty of congregants who may well have been opposed to their sexual orientation quoting Scripture. I was interested in the Scripture that you chose to use in your presentation, and you did not use the one piece of Scripture from Leviticus that has so often been used as one who lived through 1988 in a congregation as a proof texting reason why God was so opposed to same-gender relationships. So I'm just wondering whether your participants talked about the struggle of engaging people at the level of biblical literalism and criticism and understanding.
You know, they really did not. When I did my literature, no, it was my history and theological paper, I did look at some of those things. I mean, Sodom and Gomorrah is also an absolute favorite of people, which has been horribly just misinterpreted, right? The sin in Sodom and Gomorrah is lack of hospitality.
But I'm just curious as to whether or not your participants talked about the need to re-educate people around those biblical stories that have been used for so long in opposition.
They did talk about bad theology. They did talk about misrepresentation. And, you know, one of their largest recommendations was we need to keep talking. Because the more we talk, the more people better understand theology of today and, you know, the interpretations that are available to us now that weren't, you know, even 20, 30 years ago.
Great. We do need to bring our time to a close. I want to thank Shirley so much. One of the themes, meta-themes that's really run through yesterday and today is, believe it or not, the theme of pain. And pain is a point of liberation, but pain needs to be understood and heard and experienced. What's it like, as Shirley points out, there's a slide up that she didn't reference, but it was up nonetheless, about what's it like to not be sure if you can get a job when you leave your current position. What's it like when people make references to pedophilia, which is, of course, what you did mention? What's that like? What's that experience like when that's what you bump into on a daily basis or on a regular basis with people who may, in fact, try to be supportive? What's that experience like? She took us to a place of pain, but also freedom and an ability to be yourself. And what's that like when you can actually be yourself and be free and allow that to be the narrative that you carry forward? And you took us through that space reflectively, and there was a tone, I think, of solemnity in the work we did. This is a very solemn piece of work that has to be done. It can be joyful, it can also be painful, and I think you were able to capture that. Shirley, thank you so much.
Thank you.